30th, November 30th.
Ooh,
Oh, wow.
exciting.
Got it.
Very exciting.
Well, we always say amongst the clergy that many are called, but few are frozen.
I'll have to remember that. All right, so good evening, everyone. And just a reminder, in case you didn't hear that, but that we are recording. And for those who didn't miss it when I just said it, Skip is terribly sorry that he cannot join us tonight. He's enjoying his 60th reunion from his
Wow.
seminary class. But he is here in spirit. And Father, unfortunately, is attending a wake tonight. One of his good friends' mom died, and he can't go to the funeral tomorrow because, of course, Saint Elizabeth will be there. So anyway, he will not be with us tonight either. So to begin, if everybody could mute themselves, and we're going to ask for God's guidance as Dennis leads us in prayer tonight.
No. Oh, Dennis. I'm sorry. I wanted to.
Okay. It's sort of a long prayer, but it's a prayer written by an archbishop from Rome. He's a friend of Pope Francis. I can't remember his name. But anyway, here it goes. Forgive us for the war, Lord. Lord Jesus, Son of God, have mercy on us sinners. Lord Jesus, born under the bombs of Kiev, have mercy on us. Lord Jesus, dead in the arms of a mother in Kharkiv, have mercy on us. Lord Jesus, in the 20-year-olds sent to the front line, have mercy on us. Lord Jesus, who continues to see hands armed with weapons under the shadow of the cross, forgive us, Lord. Forgive us if not content with the needs with which we pierced your hand. I'm sorry, the nails which we pierced your hand. We continue to drink from the blood of the dead torn apart by weapons. Forgive us if these hands that you had created to protect have been turned into instruments of death. Forgive us, Lord, if we continue to kill our brother. Forgive us, Lord, if we continue to kill our brother. If we continue, like Cain, to take the stones from our field to kill Abel. Forgive us if we go out of our way to justify cruelty. If in our pain, we legitimize the cruelty of our actions. Forgive us the war, Lord. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, we implore you to stop the hand of Cain. Enlighten our conscience. Let not our will be done. Do not abandon us to our own doing. Stop us, Lord. Stop us. And when you have stopped the hand of Cain, take care of him also. He is our brother. O Lord, stop the violence. Stop us, Lord. Amen.
God, hear our prayer. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Mm-hmm.
So tonight we embark on our continual learning as we discussed last meeting. And our future topics will be driven by all of you and what you saw, read, or heard that you want to share as a good discussion. But tonight we welcome our guest speaker, and we thank Audrey for recommending him. So Richard Messick is a native Baltimorean who, as a self-described Baltimore enthusiast, has enjoyed researching and sharing our city's history. His primary outlet is with Baltimore Heritage, a nonprofit historic and architectural preservation organization, for which he gives tours of Greenmount Cemetery and the vaults of Lexington Market. He is also a docent at Evergreen Museum and Library, the Garrett family estate on North Charles Street. So you might want to take that tour sometime. Several years ago, after taking a tour at Hampton Mansion, titled Enforced Servitude. He began researching the slave trade in Baltimore. So we are very fortunate to have him tonight to learn more about that topic as he gives his presentation on Baltimore's 19th century slave markets. And we thank you, Richard, for joining us, and we welcome you, and we certainly appreciate your time.
Glad to be here. I should add, there's something I should, oh, at the end of, when you were talking, it occurred to me, sometimes recently I've been asked if at the end of my tours, are you a historian? I'm like, well, no, I'm a former actor that likes to write his own scripts. So this one obviously is not a script that I get to crack jokes on, needless to say. I got it. You've already mentioned the one inspiration for this presentation was the tour I took at Hampton Mansion. Before I get going and before I bring up the PowerPoint, just all of you look like you've done this a few times before, but I'm just going to suggest, if you want to, or you didn't know this, in the upper right, you click on view and you can change it to the speaker view. That just puts the speaker up front, and it makes a little box for it when I bring up the PowerPoint, which I will do right now as I'm speaking. Okay, so I got into this. It's been a long awakening, I should say. The first time it occurred to me that there were two, or I should say, the first time it really hit me of the two countries that we live in was after I returned from a tour to a vacation. We went to Charleston, and a week after our vacation, of course, when you get back to work, how was your vacation? Well, I'll be happy to tell you, and I usually do. So I described in Charleston to this to one of the administrative assistants that I was working with at the time, who was an African-American woman from Charleston. I was describing what I saw there and how much I enjoyed it. And when I got to the part about the market, which is a 4-block long building or series of buildings or sheds, filled today with a lot of high-end shops and tourist stuff and ready food and whatnot. She said something to me that made me think she believed the entire market was where people were sold. And I had taken a walking tour in which I was shown near the market where people were sold in Charleston. It was at the far end of one of the buildings, out in the open. I wasn't going to correct her. This was her reality, and I realized for her that, for me, it was a portion of my history. It was something I was aware of, but for her, it was the core of her history. And that's the first time that I woke up to that fact. And I'm using that word intentionally. I'm embracing that word woke as opposed to as being used as a pejorative these days. But it's how I woke up. One of my first memories of waking up to this. So moving right along, what are we doing here? How did we get here? This first bullet is addressing that issue of that fog and how our history is sometimes a fog in many of our brains. Then for me, the awakening, so to speak, continued much later, much more recently. A tour of Hampton Mansion, the enforced servitude tour that was mentioned, was quite an eye-opener for me. If it still exists, I'm not sure that the woman who created it is still there or not, but if it's still there, I highly recommend it. Then also Hampton Mansion, there was a grant from the national parks in which many entities got together and worked on putting names to the list, full names or identities to the lists of people that were enslaved by the Ridgely family. And it ended up with an all-day conference where these various entities like Towson, UMBC, of course, Hampton, presented all this information. So for that, Gregory Weidman and Cheryl LaRoche, I'm eternally grateful. And Ananse Senfo is the woman who gave that tour, but like I said, I don't think she's there anymore. And my primary source when I was doing a series of some research inspired by all this, I came across a book by Ralph Clayton. He was a former Pratt research librarian who put together a book laying out where all the locations were in Baltimore of where people were sold, identifying likely places. In the process of reading this book, I was a little bit confused. I wanted to kind of pinpoint where everything was, so I created myself a Google map. That ultimately wound up on the Baltimore Heritage website. And then from there, I was asked, would you mind creating a presentation? And here we are. A word on language. Sometimes I'll be falling into the language of the day. We're talking about slave markets. And I think we all understand using it as a noun, identifying a person as a slave is a bit demeaning. Enslaved people is more appropriate, but as I go through this, we're talking about a slave market, which was what they were and how they were referred to in the day. That and a few other things, just be aware. So what led to this business of the slave trade, and I refer to it as a business because initially it was not a business as such. So several things: increased cotton production, the US expansion, and labor supply and demand. So the increased production came about initially because of the cotton gin or engine, which made for much easier separation of the cotton boll from its seed. I just acquired these recently. You might even notice a few more over my shoulder here. But I wanted to see these up close. So think about pulling apart a cotton ball that you pull out of your medicine chest, and just picking it apart to separate it is annoying at the very least. Imagine, as you see in this depiction here, people pouring over them, and picking them apart. So the cotton gin picks up that speed considerably, and then the trade really takes off. The next thing that affects the growth of the cotton as an industry is the expansion of the country. Initially, we've got, now this map gives a lot more information than I'm talking about here, but it illustrates what I'm referring to. You've got initially the colonies over here, and then the Northwest Territory opens up from the Treaty of Paris in 1787. So that becomes open to the US. And then eventually the Louisiana Purchase opens up a whole lot more land. Well, the area, of course, that we're focused on is down here. So the growth really takes off with Northwest Territory. And then, but in the South, obviously, cotton takes off considerably because of the cotton gin, and we've got land now. Also, this area here, under Jackson's administration, they just cleared out all the Native Americans to make room to grow more cotton. So covers the cotton production, the growth, and then we get into supply and demand. In the mid-Atlantic states, we originally were very much into growing tobacco here, but it tapered off during the 18th century and moved over to cereal grains, wheat, rye, oats, etc., which was much less labor intensive. Consequently, in the mid-Atlantic area, there was excess labor, so to speak. And a lot of the people a lot of the landowners and plantation owners who had a large a group of enslaved people started renting them out, so to speak. They let other people use them for whatever they needed. So there was this excess labor, if you will, in the mid-Atlantic region and a demand in the South. So that's why Maryland, especially Baltimore, became quite a hub for the selling of people. Then another factor is in 1808 is when the act prohibiting the importation of slaves is enacted. So that means no more new people being sold from Africa to the United States. So the supply is cut off. So there's demand in the labor, supply is cut off. Maryland and the Mid-Atlantic region starts selling south. Sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. There's one last bit I wanted to put in here. I forgot to reference is just FYI. This is kind of a side note. What does middle passage mean? Many of you may probably already know, but as while I was doing this and I finally got it in my head, is this triangle here. This is the middle passage down here that I've marked. So you've got raw goods coming from the colonies over to back to Europe. Europe is manufacturing stuff and bringing it down here to Africa to purchase people from the various tribes. And that's why this is called the Middle Passage. So as I said, we've got the Mid-Atlantic decreased demand, cotton gin speeds up production, the cotton booms in the South and the new territories, labor is cut off, and then the traffickers swarmed the Mid-Atlantic region, where 1 million people in the 50 years leading up to the Civil War sold south. So the development of the slave markets into a formal business. It was very informal initially, and I'll go through this. It's a state, initially it's primarily over either estate auctions or taverns and hotel transactions, general intelligence offices, and then it goes to slave pens and jails. The estate auctions are just like we experience today, where people are getting rid of all their possessions through death or bankruptcy or whatever reason, just the COVID hit, and let's clean the house. So estate auctions are what they were then, or today what they were then. Commodities of every type, of course, linens, glassware, and furniture, but then it included people. So that's how some of the transactions took place. And here you've got a sample of an ad where all these household goods and furnitures, including a Negro woman, slave accustomed to housework, about 26 years age. It gives her a description. The informal transactions were the thing I found most interesting, in that back in the day, the way people kept up with the news and business was in hotels, taverns, and inns of various types, where they would possibly, they would either go to meet friends or business acquaintances to discuss what's going on, keep getting up with the news. There were lots of newspapers in these locations. And they would also arrange for meetings there by posting ads in the papers. So-and-so has, looking for a certain type of individual, or for sale a certain type of individual, or linens, horses, what have you, farm equipment. That's how they would arrange meetings to make these purchases or sales. So a lot of informal transactions took place in these taverns and hotels. What I've depicted here are some of the ones more prominent in Baltimore. Barnum's Hotel, you can see right here in the lower right-hand corner, that's the edge of the Battle Monument on, Calvert Street. That's where the Barnum's Hotel was located. The General Wayne Inn and the Indian Queen Hotel. These are just a couple of the major ones, but they all took place. They grew out of the area around Center Market. Center Market was the primary city market at the time in the early 19th century. It's where, well, most of us in the audience here know it as the fish market. But it was, that fish market was built obviously after the fire, but it was on the location where an enormous city market was located. It was called initially Marsh Market or Center Market. Baltimore Street was the northern boundary, and it had previously been known as Market Street. So another method of selling or transferring and help or getting work or labor, intelligence offices or agencies. These are similar to employment agencies today, where the agency would broker between the person looking for employment or the employer. And they would also act as brokers for enslavers who didn't want to handle the transactions of selling people. Sometimes they would act as brokers for the enslavers who wanted to hire out their slaves. Jails were used, community jails as they are today, but they also would house enslaved persons, for instance, while the enslaver was away from home and they needed to keep them someplace. Or if the enslavers heading, like, for instance, traveling from Philadelphia, for instance, to Washington, D.C. They stop in Baltimore, what to do with the help? They will, the enslavers would stay at the hotel, of course, but their enslaved had to be put someplace special. Some hotels provided for that. Otherwise, they would go to the local jail, pay them a fee, and they would stay there for the night. They also incarcerated any African Americans suspected of being a runaway. Fees for housing the slaves would then be brought, one from the owner were they retrieved, or if they weren't retrieved, they were sold off in auction. The jailer and the jails would then get a cut. Later in the 19th century, these runaways were not necessarily runaways. Well, suspect whether they ever were, all of them were in fact runaways, or whether they just picked up some poor freed soul in the city. So eventually the slave traders started building their own jails to manage their stock and charging fees for housing them for other enslavers. Two of the most infamous in Baltimore were Austin Wolfe and Hope Slater. Austin Wolfe was born in 1796. He grew up in Tennessee and participated in the War of 1812 as a teenager. And because of his experience during the war, he got to look firsthand at the growth of cotton and the need for labor. So eventually he arrives in Baltimore in 1816. He's 19 years old. He places an ad in the paper: cash for slaves, 300 Negroes wanted. Now think of somebody opening up shop. I'm going to start a used car business. And they put a bill on a telephone pole in the city. 300 cars wanted, cash in hand. This is an absurd declaration, and it was then too. But this is what Austin Wolfe wanted to do. He wanted to kind of shake people's consciousness and make them aware that old Joe you've got working for you in the yard, just doing odd chores, he's worth cash. So they're kind of, he wants to shake people's thinking up. And he's making outlandish claims like, 300 Negroes wanted. He never would acquire that many at once. So once he through these bills that he posts everywhere and ads, he'd get his first coffle. That's a gang of people who were being marched south. He would head off and march them to Augusta, Georgia. He marched them chained together from here to Georgia, where his uncle would then sell the captives locally. He began building this business model that eventually inspired Franklin and Armfield. Franklin and Armfield were the biggest purveyors of people in the ever in the country, in the US. They operated in DC in what is now Alexandria, Virginia. And their house and their headquarters is now a museum to the slave trade. So like I said, they were inspired by Austin Wolfe. They used his model of papering the countryside and sending out agents throughout the countryside to elicit, like I said, to kind of shake up the thinking of people that, old Joe or whoever they're worth money. So he's got agents all over. Some of his family members would actually set up shop in Easton or Cambridge, for instance. And this is how he built his stock. And like I said, Franklin Armfeld basically copied his business model. So eventually, he wants to be respectable. So he buys a location, a house, and he puts a jail behind it, also known as a pen. Yes, they were called pens. That was located at Pratt and what is now Martin Luther King Boulevard. As I said, he built this large family network, regional network, scours the jails for runaways. Sometimes they kidnap people to put them on the market. He dies of tuberculosis while he's on a business trip in 1847. Then there's Hope Slater. He's born 1790 in Georgia, arrives in Baltimore in 1835. By this time, the sale of people is really becoming a prime business here in Baltimore. He does the same thing, starts advertising for the purchase of slaves, similar to Wolfe's beginnings. He builds his jail on Howard Street near Howard, between Howard and Sharp Street. There's a row of townhouses right next to the location of where his jail cell slave pen was. But those townhouses still stand, and they were there then. There's a description of it. It was a 2-story brick building to house the enslaved, a paved yard 40 feet by 75. The yard contained a few benches, a hydrant, numerous wash tubs, a clothesline. On the west side was an auction block, and on the opposite, a brick fireplace used for cooking and warmth. He sold his jail to Bernard Moore and Lewis Campbell in 1848. And one of his last transactions was a historic one. He purchased about 30 of the 70+ people who attempted to escape from DC on the schooner Pearl. This story has been written up. It included members of the Edmondson family. Their father was a free man and managed to contact, he was a free man, but his wife was a slave when the children were born. Consequently, all their children were considered slaves. Excuse me while I look up a little bit of this information about them, their names and whatnot. Oh, Emily and Mary. So as I said, the children were tried to escape on the Pearl. Dad, who was a free man, reached out to some abolitionists who managed to scrape together some money to purchase 2 of the daughters, who eventually were educated and took care of Harriet Beecher Stowe and the Reverend Henry Beecher. Slater dies in New Orleans of yellow fever in 1853. This is the fireplace that was on the grounds of Slater's jail, of his pen. So as I mentioned, it was on Howard Street on Pratt Street at Howard. And this fireplace was in place until 1840, when it was, and the building it lasted at least until the 20th century. I have some photos of both of these at the end of the slideshow. But it was torn down in around 1840 because B&O owned the property at this point, and they wanted to put up a building. That plaque you see there was put up by the the Miller brothers of the restaurant, Miller Brothers, commemorating what was here. So the plaque and the fireplace were taken down. They were moved to the Bailey Roundhouse, which is was just south of where the football stadium is today. Unfortunately, it was torn down in the 50s. This was there that was being used as a museum at the time. I guess the original B&O museum at the Bailey's Roundhouse, but that was torn down in the 50s, and I have no idea what became of the fireplace or the plaque. If anybody has a lead, if anybody knows any descendants of the Miller brothers, put me in touch. Let's talk about the good guys now. John Greenleaf Whittier, an abolitionist, was told by Slater that the enslaved were very well fed and clothed at his jail. Also, he didn't trade in children. However, he had advertised for a sprightly, bright mulatto girl, only 7 years old, price $250. So, believe it or not, he wasn't forthcoming with the abolitionists. Then there's Benjamin Lundy. He was an abolitionist who used his newspaper, The Genius of Universal Emancipation, to expose the atrocities of slavery. And one of his targets, needless to say, was Austin Wolfe. Not long after this very particularly damning article in 1825, the two run across one another on the streets of Baltimore, and Wolfe beats him to the ground and stomps him, and who knows what would have become of him had the bystanders intervened. Went to trial, judge found Wolfe guilty and charged him $1. Then we have William Lloyd Garrison. His career as an abolitionist really took off when he came to Baltimore to work for Lundy. Though they held slightly different views. For instance, Garrison believed in immediate and uncompensated emancipation, whereas Lundy leaned towards gradual and compensated. His mission to abolish slavery, Garrison's, took off from here. His anti-slavery society sponsored abolitionist orators such as Frederick Douglass, William Wells Brown, and he published the first editions of their biographies. Another active abolitionist was Moses Shepherd, who let's hold off before we get to that. Moses Shepherd was very active. He was active supporter of the Protective Society of Maryland to protect free Negroes, the American Anti-Slavery Society, and the Society of Friends Indian Affairs Committee. Okay, so what does it mean actually when we use the phrase sold south? Here's an account written in 1816 by a man named James Kirk Paulding, in which he describes one of the coffles I was discussing earlier. The sun was shining out of very hot, and turning an angle of the road, we encountered the following group. First, a little cart drawn by one horse in which 5 or 6 half-naked black children were tumbled like pigs together. In the uncovered cart, they seemed to have been actually broiled to sleep. Following them marched 3 black women with head, neck, and breasts uncovered and without shoes or stockings. Next came 3 men bareheaded, half-naked, chained together with an ox chain. Driving the group was a white man on horseback, carrying his pistols in his belt. Paulding later learned that these bond persons had been purchased in Maryland and were being driven south of Virginia for resale. So picking cotton meant everyone worked. All ages doing everything from picking cotton and carrying water, from sunrise to sunset in August in the South. They would have said working from can't see to can't see. This is a phrase I learned when one day at Hampton Mansion, I went there for a kind of an open house, and there was some, I can't forget the pronunciation, griot, Black African-American storytellers were there in front of what was the foreman's house, ironically, telling their stories. And afterwards, I followed them on a tour that Anaquali were giving them. And there was some point during this tour where one of them referred to that, used that phrase, can't see to can't see. And everybody just kind of nodded. I'm white guy from North Baltimore. What? I leaned to one of them and asked, what was that phrase? And she explained it to me, sunrise to sunset. So, my lesson takeaway from that was there was a very specific phrase handed down today. I don't think it was just the storytellers that used it, but that phrase, can't see to can't see, sunrise to sunset. The most appalling aspect of this is one we've all are aware of, I believe, but it needs to be said, basically. Fancy girl was a term used by the slave traders to describe women for use as they will. There's a horrifying, ugly letter quoted in a Washington Post article about the nephew of Franklin. I mentioned Franklin and Armfeld. James Purvis Franklin was a trader here in Baltimore, working for his uncle in the firm. So a member of the family, and there are letters where he's describing the ways of some of the women that he's got for sale. It's an appalling, awful description, but I'm including it here as what does it mean? What does that mean? What does that conjure up, that phrase, sold south? And all of these things are just their tip, the very tip of the iceberg, so to speak. So the end of the markets happens in 1863. This is a quote from an article in the Sun paper in 1936. The end of the slave jails in Baltimore was July 24th, 1863. On that date, which was shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, Colonel Birney, Lieutenant Sykes, and Sergeant Southward proceeded to Slaters Jail, now Campbell's, where he enlisted the male Negroes in the army and liberated the female slaves. In his report to the Assistant Adjutant General, Birney says, "In this place, I found 26 men, 1 boy, 29 women, and 3 infants." So the Emancipation Proclamation, it was the longest time before I realized how narrow that proclamation was. It only affected the rebellious states. It declares all persons held slaves within the rebellious states are free. It wasn't until in Maryland, the Constitution ends slavery here in 1864, and that's where we get our nickname, the Free State. And then the 13th Amendment is ratified December 6, 1865. So I'd like to address some of the myths that grow up around this whole topic. For instance, I came across an article during my research that was fascinating to me. In 1937, some utility workers were doing some digging and came across this tunnel in a location that's now under the convention center. All the locals, all the old timers, so to speak, who were interviewed for this article swore that this had to be Slatter's tunnel. They knew it was, it was a tunnel that he used to get, think of this, Howard Street and along Pratt, from Howard down to the harbor to transport the enslaved. And it's backed up by a slave narrative by Rezin Williams, R-E-Z-I-N, Williams. He was interviewed for the WPA slave narratives in the late 1930s. At the time, he's 115 years old. And historians have taken issue with some of the other comments he's made in the narrative, including his description of leading a group of people through a dark tunnel. We don't know. First, if he's referring to this tunnel that's in Baltimore or not, but we don't know if we don't have anything to back up his story. And the tunnel in Baltimore, if you think about it, it was a legal business. Why would Slater or Campbell or any of them go to the trouble of digging this tunnel 3 or 4 blocks long beneath the city streets to hide a legal activity? So it's highly unlikely that any of these tunnels were in fact used to transport the enslaved. I've talked to a couple archaeologists who get apoplectic when this topic comes up, and they pour out all their reasons, some of which I just stated. So that's one of the myths. There's another tunnel that was at Howard and Lombard Street that was, people, oh, that had to have been one of their slave tunnels. No, that was it was the beginnings of they were about to build a spur to one of the railway lines, and that was going to be the station, but it went unfinished and then covered over. That was at Howard and Lombard. There's a tunnel or a tunnel-like area underneath Orchard Street Church. The Baltimore City archaeologist, he's one of the 2 that I talked to on this topic, and she said that believes she was the one who headed the digging of that and determined that it was really part of the heating system. The Charleston Market area that I just mentioned, the story of that was, it was a story that grew much larger than it was, in fact. And then my own personal little myth, when my mother was in her 90s, she was telling me the story of being taken by her father. As a child, the family often visited this big house, this big mansion, antebellum mansion, that the one member of the family who really was super successful. He always had an open house on major holidays. So my grandfather took all of his children out there many times. And one of these visits, my mother's there, and somebody shows her in the basement these chains on the wall. And he said, this house used to be on the Underground Railroad. That's why they're here. Mom, have you ever thought about this story? Was my response to it. She was in her 90s and she took this, she still has this childhood memory that she carried through decades later and never questioned it. She just never questioned it. It was something she was told as a child, and as a child, you believe whatever your adults tell you, right? But it was a real kind of knock up the side of my head. It was like, I don't think so, Mom. There wouldn't be a chain here if this is part of the Underground Railroad. This photo on the left, that's a staged photo. It was taken in 1910 for the Sun paper. This is at the Slater slave jail that we've been talking about. This is the area of where it was situated, right in here where this building stands today. This, wait a minute, where did it go? I lost it. Oh, I showed you, I showed you the fireplace. The fireplace in that earlier photograph would have been right along this area here, possibly up against that wall. That I don't know. But this is the series of townhouses that I was talking about earlier. They date from that 19th century, and on the very end was Moses Shepherd's house. Ironic, since he was an abolitionist. This is a photo taken of Camden Yard, the Camden Station, Camden Yards, the original Camden Yards, from the Roma Seltzer Tower not long after it was built in 1911. This circle over here is I think it's possible and likely to be the remains of Joseph Donovan's slave pen, which was at this location up until the Civil War. But looking at this building along here makes me feel like it's possible, at the very least it's possible, if not likely, that this is a pen. And this is the yard of this jail. I don't know. It's speculation, pure speculation on my part, but this is in the location where Donovan's slave pen was. And this is the Babe Ruth statue at Camden Yards. Right behind Babe Ruth is this location here. So the next time you're at a game, look over his shoulder. That was the location, whether that building was the building, and think about it, this is only 50 years later. This was an industrial area. Why tear down a perfectly good building? So it's possible, if not likely, that that was the original slave pen of Joseph Donovan. His grave, ironically, looks over the location of John Wilkes Booth burial plot at Greenmount Cemetery. I totally skipped over some of these. This map here, I usually show it in the middle of my talk, but there's no reason not to show it now. This is a map, and I'm going to put links to these websites in the chat, or at least email it to somebody so you have them. This is a fascinating 3D map of Baltimore as it appeared in 1815. You can zoom in. It's an excellent quality map to places like Fort McHenry. Or, here, I'll show you. You are here. This is where St. Vincent's is, roughly. This is the Jones Falls.
Map isn't up.
Pardon me?
The map is not up.
You don't see the map. What happened to the map? Why is it not?
Doesn't look like your little hand clicked on the bearings early Baltimore.
Well, if he's seeing it, it must have clicked, but maybe he's only sharing his PowerPoint and not his full screen.
That can be a feature of Zoom.
Let me try bringing it up again. Oh, I see. Yes, you're sorry. I have to click on the various tabs. Sorry. Now?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, so this is created by at the time that the War of 1812 brouhaha, a couple years ago here in Baltimore, the celebrations at Fort McHenry and whatnot. This was created around that time. So by UMBC's something imaging center. So again, let's start back. So you got the full view here. So this is downtown Baltimore in 1815. Here's the Inner Harbor right here. And then what I thought I was showing you earlier, the church, St. Vincent's de Paul's, is roughly right here. I think that's the correct intersecting street. Is it Baltimore or Fayette? Maybe it's here.
It's
Anyway,
Fayette.
this is the Jones Falls. And this is the market I was referring to, Center Market. You can see it's in a huge complex. This is Baltimore Street. You're at Fayette, so it would have been up here.
Mhm.
This is St. Vincent de Paul, roughly. Obviously, that's not it. It wasn't built then. But these stalls you see here, these sheds rather, this is Center Market, also known as Marsh Market. Over here, each area is labeled the fish market, the horse market, just the general, these, the Center Market complex in general. Over here, I have seen a Baltimore map in which here in the horse market area is where people were sold. I know there typically the city markets weren't used, like for instance, the Charleston market, where they did have a platform or a stage or a staging area to sell people at the Charleston market. And I believe they did here at Center Market, but the other city markets, not so much. There would be court-ordered sales that would take place at various markets. There's a record of one taking place at Lexington Market, and some more at Broadway Market, where again, it was like an estate sale, and an auctioneer would basically set up shop near the market because there are a lot of people there. So he, it's a ready audience, so to speak. But this, as far as I know, is the only market in town which they had a dedicated area for the sale of people. And to give you a sense of the size of the city at that time. Okay. Here we are at the Inner Harbor. I'm going to zoom in right over here to the right of the screen, which looks like the country, to show you this, which is Lexington Market. So that was at the western edge of town in 1815. This shed was built around 1806 or 7. That's when the shed was built for Lexington Market. So that was the edge of town at the time of the time we're talking about. But of course, the 19th century, everything boomed and took off because of all of these factors we talked about. Primarily the Northwest Territory, the slave trade certainly added considerably to the business of Baltimore. But the trade with the Northwest Territories was thriving. That's how so many merchants that came to make it big here, like the Garretts, for instance. They were merchants taking their goods on Conestoga wagons or manufactured goods out west and bringing back in the raw goods. So Lexington Market was, that's why it took off at this point, because of that Northwest access to that area of the country. Then, hold on. That is States of Baltimore. I'm going to stop share for there and change it. This is a map that I created to sort my brain out when I was doing this research, and it's now on the Baltimore Heritage website. And again, this link will be included. But these are the color coding you can see match up to the various categories I've got over here on the left. All the yellow are the inns and the taverns. Then the blue are the auction houses. City agencies are the general intelligence offices, the employment agencies, and then the city markets are in blue, and the pens and jails are in green. Now, I don't have absolutely everything labeled. I have some of the like the major inns and hotels, the most prominent ones that were used listed here, but you can click on them and open up a little more information about the various operators who worked in these locations. Notice there was one near the church. Oh, that was the hotel. Was it like one of the taverns and hotels that was used? So this is the center market area. So there's a lot of places around here, especially estate auctions took place around here because, again, it was the main market, proximity to the docks. So a lot of business transactions took place around this area. Also, there were a lot of transactions took place on the docks, literally, off the ship. Sometimes estate houses or auction houses were set up on the docks to take advantage of the incoming trade. But this is just to give you a sense of some of the various locations in Baltimore at the time. I'm going to stop talking now and answer questions if I can, if you have any.
You are muted, everyone, I believe. So if you have a question. This would be very unusual.
I don't see your chat.
Yeah,
Oh, there
well,
it is.
I would just say thank you. It was so extremely interesting.
I can't say it was my pleasure because it was my edification.
It was disturbingly real.
Yes. Yeah, I've had, it's been quite a journey for me, exploring all of this and learning what I've learned. It's really been quite an eye-opener. I just posted in the chat those links I was referencing earlier.
Okay.
Oh, great. Thank you.
There's one I need to, excuse me, I would like to show you this one other one. because it requires a little bit of description, and it's well worth the trouble to learn how to manipulate it. Where'd it go? Oh. This one I just started exploring the other day. I'm only somewhat familiar with it, but I'll show you the two areas worth checking out: the transatlantic and the inter-American slave voyages is what this is.
Are we silent?
Yes.
Hold on. Just a second. Yeah, click here's the way into either one of these, transatlantic or inter-American. Click on database, and then oh, here. See, like I said, I just found this the other day. So click on database under one of these, and then data visualization. And it will give you a, here, the time lapse. Allows you to see over, notice the clicker in the top left corner, ticking off the time. You can speed this up by clicking down here in the lower right. If you click on, it's going, speed is twice the one, I guess, and then you can pick it up and the time will zip along. So you can get a rough idea of some of the passages, the ships that are transporting people for sale. So
That's just the number of ships, and think
yes.
of how, oh my gosh.
Yes, and this is just the intra-America trade. We're not looking at the transatlantic trade. And when we get to 1808, you'll see it's all the United States. Let me move this up a little bit. Okay, so now it's 1800, so it's coming up to 1808, 6, 7, 8. And now we're going to see it shift dramatically from the mid-Atlantic to the south. All the trade in the United States is amongst ourselves, so to speak. And of course, until the Civil War. Whoops. So this is worth exploring. As you can see, I had to stumble over to get to that time lapse. But if you go, like I said, here's the transatlantic database time lapse. And again, you'll see across the and like I said, this is just for ships. I'm going to pick this up again. Late 18th century, early 19th century. And we'll turn up the speed. It's unsettling, to say the least. I forget what year it actually is finally outlawed everywhere.
So the 1808 law that prohibited the importation was just for certain countries,
United States.
just for the United States.
The,
Noticed it was still going to South America.
I believe Britain was a few years earlier. Don't quote me on that. But around that time is when those that all started. It started the outlaw.
I got a question. Can you hear me?
Yes. Mhm.
I just saw The Woman King, which is about the slave trade out of Dahomey, about, among other things, from West Africa. So there's a lot of dispute about, it's only a 2-hour movie and it's a big story. But do you have any thoughts about that movie or any movies that you would recommend that are good for understanding the slave trade?
I'm afraid not. I've not seen that movie. And quite honestly, I'm too chicken to watch most of them. 12 Years a Slave, I understand, is a very good movie. But I have yet to bring myself to watch it.
Brutal.
Yeah. So I'm not the best judge. I'm the best person to ask that question because difficult.
It's Audrey. We watch, one of my favorite shows is Henry Louis Gates' Finding Your Roots. And he had S. Apatha Murkison.
Yes.
Yeah. She had no idea of this history, but he traced her roots to the slaves who were sold by the Jesuits at Georgetown.
And she kept saying, she got me when she kept going, they have a name. They have a name. That just tore me up.
Yeah.
But
it puts a whole new complexion on, because they were all sold south.
Yeah.
They were no longer needed in Maryland, and Georgetown needed money to survive as a college, and they sold them south. Yeah.
272, I believe.
Yeah. Danny and Rita.
Her ancestor, they named one of the buildings on campus after that ancestor of Apatha Murkison's.
Generally speaking, the people who were taken from Africa, were they captured by other Africans who they were warring with? Or I heard something about that years ago and I've never heard more.
That is true. Whether that was the only source for the Europeans, I don't know. But I know part of the source were other, warring tribes who would capture and sell their enemy, which is frankly an age-old.
Yeah.
I give a tour at Evergreen. There's a tapestry there depicting the release of the prisoners, which was 2 warring tribes, both sides Jewish, the Judeans and the Israelites. And the prophet, I forget which prophet, said, you cannot enslave your brothers. So it's an age-old story, warring tribes selling their captured enemy as booty.
The Armistead is an old movie that is very good as far as the slave trade. It talks about John Quincy Adams, who was an abolitionist himself when he wasn't, in office as president. I think while he was a congressman, he did many things as far as abolition went, and as a lawyer to free slaves. Hampton Mansion was mentioned, which most people know there was many slaves, but of course near St. Vincent's is one of the Carroll mansions, and a prominent Catholic who owned the family owned many slaves too.
Yeah, Armistead I did see. I do remember that being a very good movie.
New Haven, Connecticut has a museum of Eli Whitney and the cotton gin, which is quite interesting.
Oh.
And also a statue on the New Haven Green of the Amistad. Amistad, like friendship, it means. Amistad was the ship, then that was at the New Haven courthouse where they were defended and freed. Were freed because they were, their case was that they were victims of kidnapping, which, and they had a winning case. Not too many of those, but.
Something you're reminding me of, just because of the geography you were referring to, you're reminding me of, in my intro, I skipped over a part where I wondered when I was first putting these together, how did we get here? In addition to, what I was affected by personally, I attended a panel discussion at the Wolfers where they were doing something similar of examining their history. And I asked that question, it's like, what shook up all the institutions in the country to do this self-reflection? And I got several answers. One was, think of the 60s and people and the empowerment of the 60s, fighting for civil rights and equal rights, African Americans, Native Americans, women, sexual minorities, all wanting a place at the table. And then their children, they have children, they grow up and they're in college in the 80s and 90s, and they start asking, where did we come from? Where do we fit in this picture? And then in the early part of this century, oh gosh, I forgot her name. The first African-American woman to head an Ivy League school. Oh gosh, I forget her name, but this is in the beginning of the 2000s. She starts basically let's look at this. Let's take a really close look at this. Ruth Simmons, Brown University. She starts the under her, the Steering Committee on Slavery and Justice began in 2003, and they made their report in 2006. And this had quite an impact on other institutions to do the same, this self-reflection. So you're mentioning the Connecticut reminded me of that a little bit. It was like, why has this become such a thing? And those are some of the answers I got when I asked that panel.
Thank you so much. Any other questions?
Well, I just have one more kind of comment. It's back to finding your roots. Questlove, who is the musical director on Jimmy Fallon, he didn't know anything about his history either. But then when they looked it up, the census records back in, I think, 1870 or 1880, listed his great-great-great-grandfather as coming from Africa, that actually had come from Africa. And it turns out that he was brought over on the Clotilde, which was the last slave ship to the United States. And it was in the 1860s, and it was because of a bet a guy made in a bar down in the South that he could go to Africa and get slaves and bring them over. And they brought them over, and as soon as they landed, all the slaves were marched off the ship and sent up the river to be sold. The Clotilde was sent further up one of the side rivers and sunk so that nobody would ever find it with its, its manacles and under the deck. But it's been found.
Yeah.
But anyway, Questlove, it was a remarkable discovery that he was, yeah.
Yeah, I missed that show. Yeah, I did not.
Oh yeah, that's worth seeing. And actually they were only here in the United States as slaves for, less than 4 or 5 years before the war was over. And they as a group got together, assembled again and started their own little town in Alabama or Mississippi called Africatown. Yeah.
Well, he was lucky to find that. I mean,
Yeah.
most of the census that I've looked at in the 1800s or mid 1800s, they only say how many slaves they had.
Yeah.
They don't mention
Oh no,
anything.
this was after slavery was over. He was a free man. So he was
He still knew his African name, I guess, because Yeah.
Jerry
Yes.
Filipowski, I think you're muted, Jerry.
Sorry about that. Mr. Messick, this has been really interesting and fascinating and heartbreaking, and I want to thank you for that. It made me think, I don't know if you heard this yesterday, it was excellent, but NPR had the great historian on John Meacham, and he's releasing a new book now on Lincoln and this period in our nation's history. And I thought when you said that some of these movies and documentaries you haven't been able to get yourself to watch, and I've been the same way for highly emotional reasons. I don't want the visuals. I got enough visuals in my brain, but Meacham was saying that Lincoln, of course, was always an abolitionist, but it took him a while to get the feel of the country before he was going to do what he did when he saw how things were going. But he said this about Lincoln, which I thought was really poignant. He said his colleagues came to him and said, just say that you're going to do something and don't do it once you're elected, because you're just not popular and you're not going to win a second time around. And basically, they were encouraging him to say he would not abolish slavery. But he said Lincoln was such a man of ethical fortitude that he said, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to say that I'm going to do something or I'm not going to do something and know all along that I am. I can't do that. He said, I can't live like that, you know. And of course, he did get elected again, but not for long.
Yeah. Right.
But that sounded like something we all might want to read.
Yeah. You know, another book, earlier when I was asked about movies, there is a movie version of this book, which I understand is very good. And again, I can only watch so much of it because I knew it was coming because I read the book. In the very beginning, the entire plantation has to watch a man being beaten or whipped. But the book, Underground Railroad, I think the author's Colson Whitehead, correct me if I'm wrong, if anybody knows. It's either that or Ta-Nehisi Coates. I always get that.
No, it's Colson Whitehead.
Yeah.
Colson Whitehead, thank you. I found that an amazing book in how it made a fantastical story out of our history. How he described various towns with their own approach. Each one had a very different approach to the interaction of Black and white. From a town that seemed idyllic, where everyone worked together, and then she moved on to various other towns. On the other extreme end of the spectrum was the town where if you're Black, you're lynched, period, end of story. But it was a fascinating kind of fantastical take, including making the Underground Railroad real, where there actually was a station underground with a real railroad and tracks and whatnot. So it's that I highly recommend if you've not read it.
I recommend reading Harriet Tubman's book, biography by Catherine Clinton, and she talks about the Underground Railroad quite a bit. And she did mention that guy, the abolitionist Garrison that you had brought up, and his relationship with Harriet Tubman, because they had a connection there too. Yeah.
So we want to thank you so much. It was really enlightening, and I know when I cross the street down here, I'm going to have to say a prayer for all the people that suffered and are still suffering from this sin of racism that we can't seem to get rid of. So thank you so much, Richard, for the wonderful presentation. And we are going to talk about our bibliography, which has gone out, and I believe I shared it with you when I sent out the Zoom link. So these good recommendations that you're mentioning now, you all make sure you get them to Jack Schmidt so that they can be added, because we will be choosing what we would like to discuss next. And I don't know how many of you watched the Harriet Tubman PBS special that was just outstanding and inspiring. It was amazing. So anyway, just email me your ideas or Jack Schmidt, and we'll make sure we include everything on the bibliography. Okay. And I did want to mention that Melanie sent us an invitation. Some of you may have received it. I will forward it tomorrow. It's about a gathering that SBCLT is having to celebrate the year. It's on Friday, November 4th from 4 to 6. If you want to mark your calendars, that's November 4th from 4 to 6. And anybody who normally works Friday night dinners, you're all excused if you would rather go to SBCLT, because I think it'll be a wonderful way to show support also. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that. And also that Skip and I attended the Game Changers event where she was recognized, Melanie was recognized as one of the game changers in Baltimore. And there were 5 people that presented game changers, different game changers, and it was amazing. And Melanie did a fantastic job, but there are a lot of movers and shakers in this city. And Dr. Brown was there, the Black Butterfly guy that we had in March. Anyway, he was there in the audience. So anyway, it was a marvelous presentation. And this tonight, Richard really puts like some whipped cream on the top of some excellent learning that we've had recently. So thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And Audrey for bringing him to us. And there was one other question that I know it's getting late. If we could just take a minute in regards to the Racial Equity Fund. So we were thinking that we need to set an annual goal to kind of keep the momentum going and then give the parish updates on what SBCLT's progress is. And they're getting ready to clear out 4 properties on Hazel Street so that they can do the rebuild in those and begin the architectural plans. So they're getting estimates now. One estimate came in at like $26,000, and that's the only one that they have so far. So we need to continue our fundraising, and thought it might be a good idea to maybe we could do something like have a giving day around Thanksgiving and encourage people maybe to give on that particular day.
Excellent idea.
Anyway, I just thought maybe we could discuss that for a couple minutes. We're so grateful that we have homes, and to, desire to help others with some affordable housing might be a good way to encourage people to donate to the fund. And even small donations add up. So any donation is a great thing. So I just thought maybe if we could take a minute to discuss it, if anybody had any other ideas.
Peggy, I just love your idea about Thanksgiving. I think that's a good idea. And this is just a personal anecdote, but during the war as an infant, I lived on Hazel Street with my grandparents, and Tom's grandparents lived 2 doors away on Hazel Street. So that is definitely our hood. We didn't actually know each other, but 2 doors living with our grandmothers who had immigrated from Poland.
That's so cool. That is so cool. We'll have to make sure we tell Melanie, and I have to give Jody credit for the Thanksgiving idea.
That's very
Doing that
good.
around Thanksgiving Day. So thank you, Jody.
Yes.
Any other thoughts about how to encourage donations or reach people that we haven't reached? E-newsletter or Marianne?
Marianne.
You're muted. Marianne,
Thank
you're
you.
muted.
Thank you. Probably not for this year, but if we did a little advanced planning, if we're going to have to continue to fundraise, Peggy, I have mentioned that game Factuality, and it's a game where for people who don't know it, was developed by a woman in Baltimore, and it is a completely eye-opening hour and a half in which you learn about the facts of life if you are Black or gay or Jewish or Hispanic, and in terms of what money you start with or don't start with, and the places you are allowed or not allowed to. And we did it at Notre Dame Prep. It's been done at colleges and universities all over the country, to really kind of give you, an idea of, well, that's not fair. Well, that's the way it is.
Is that the one that's based on the Monopoly board?
Yes.
That's
Natalie
Yeah.
Gillard. Natalie Gillard is the founder. And I do know, I think if she were to bring the game to St. Vincent's, it could be expensive, but they do have times when they do $25 per person, but that money goes to they donate the money to a cause. And I don't know whether they would be willing to do that, and any $25 we did could go to the equity fund. That would take some communication, and it certainly couldn't be done by the end of this year, but it's a thought out there for some time.
All right, I appreciate that, Mary, and I haven't forgotten that. Maybe we will talk to the E&E committee about doing something like that for one of our Wednesday nights in Lent. And to get the whole parish
That's good. Yes.
coming and interested. So that's a great idea. So thank you.
You're welcome.
And just keep in mind, any idea is welcome. And the only other thing I want to mention before we leave is that Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, they have sent emails around. I don't know if you've seen them, but they're asking us to vote for question H, which I know we talked a lot about police reform in the last election and the last couple. And this one has to do with the local control in Baltimore City. So I wanted to mention that. And also, I got something from them too about Hopkins. Apparently they're trying to come up with their own police force, and they are against Hopkins creating their police force. So I know some of you like to follow what Showing Up for Racial Justice suggests, and I just wanted to make sure you were aware of those two things. So the one is question H on the ballot, and they are for question H in Baltimore City, for those.
Oh, city, okay.
So anything else before Liz gives us our final prayer? Well, again, thank you so much, Richard. It was a delight meeting you, and we so appreciate all the information. So thank you. Wonderful. All right, Liz, can you close us out with God?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Lord, St. Paul exhorts all of us to grow into Christ's body, building it up and strengthening it in love. But we cannot do this if we are stuck in a shell of complacency and self-interest. We become blind to the injustices and racism all around. So empower us, Lord, to break out of our old self-limiting skins and walk out into a new way of living. Embolden us to seek truth, challenge half-truths and disinformation, work for justice at many levels, and begin to build up the body of Christ. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so much. Beautiful prayers, beginning and ending the meeting, Dennis and Liz. So thank you. All right, I'm going to stop the recording shortly unless anybody has anything really pertinent they want to share with the group. All right, thank you all.
Thank you all.
Oh, if anybody
Sure.
didn't hear, Skip had his 60th reunion from the seminary with his seminary group tonight, and that is why he is not here. And Sharon's in Kenya on a safari. Anyway, people are all over the place, so enjoy. All right, you all have a great rest of your week, and thanks for coming.
Thanks all.
Okay, Peggy.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you, Richard.
Thanks, Richard.
Have a few people still here.
Hi,
You won't
Peg.
have me tomorrow night to kick around, Peggy.
You won't be there. Okay,
No,
I'll let Sherry know. How do you feel, Chuck?
better, but not spectacular.
How's Pat?
She's getting better.
Okay, good. Well, I hope you feel better.
Yeah, good luck.
Thanks.
All
I
right.
know Jody knows what it's like,
Yep.
Does.
unfortunately.
Yeah.
All right.
Hopefully you do well.
Yeah, feel better. Jody, you go ahead. I know you have to
Thanks.
drive home, so take care.
Okay, well,
I'll talk to you when you get home.
I'll call you on my way.
Okay.
All
All
right,
right.
bye.
See ya. Hi, John. Hi, Joe. Hi, Joe. If you're still on, Joe, I'm gonna sign us off here.